The wine glass shattered against the marble floor, ruby liquid spreading like an accusation across pristine white tiles. "You clumsy, worthless creature!" Beatrice Ashford's voice cut through the dining room, silencing the polite conversation that had filled the space moments before. "Look what you've done!" Eleanor's hands trembled as she knelt, gathering shards of crystal while her heart hammered against her ribs. The cold from the floor seeped through her worn dress. She hadn't dropped the glass. Beatrice had knocked it from her hand deliberately. They both knew it. "I apologize, Mrs. Ashford," Eleanor murmured, keeping her eyes down. 15 years. 15 years of this, and she still felt the burn of shame every time. "Apologize?" Beatrice's laugh was sharp, as the glass cutting into Eleanor's palm. "You embarrass us, in front of the Duke of Ravenswood himself. Get out of my sight. Mrs. Peters will finish serving." Eleanor rose, blood from her cut palm mixing with wine on her fingers. She risked one glance at the table before fleeing. The other guests looked away, uncomfortable. Her half-brother, Charles, examined his plate with intense fascination. Only one person met her eyes. The Duke of Ravenswood watched her with an expression she couldn't read. His gray eyes were steady, assessing. Not pitying, something else. Something that made her stomach twist with an emotion she'd forgotten how to name. She fled to the kitchen, her face burning. "Let me see that hand," Mrs. Peters said, the cook's voice gentler than Eleanor had heard in months. The older woman wrapped her palm in clean cloth. "That woman grows crueler every day. She's right to be angry. I should have been more careful." The lie tasted bitter, but what else could Eleanor say? This was her life. Had been since she was 15 and her father died, leaving her to his legitimate son's mercy. "Your father would have wept to see you like this," Mrs. Peters whispered, so quietly Eleanor almost missed it. But she heard, and the words hurt worse than the cut. Eleanor spent the rest of the evening in the scullery, scrubbing pots while laughter drifted from the dining room. She'd lived in this house her entire life, first as the secret daughter, given education and books and almost love, then as the inconvenient reminder of her father's indiscretion. When he died, Charles had made his position clear. She could stay, but only if she earned her keep. No wages, no status, just a room in the attic and the honor of serving the family that shared her blood, but not her name. She was 30 years old and had nothing, no money, no prospects, no future. Just this. Through the window above the sink, she watched the Duke's carriage pull away into the December night. Snow had begun to fall, soft and silent. For a moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to climb into that carriage and simply leave, to be someone else, somewhere else. But those were dangerous thoughts. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She dried her hands and climbed the narrow stairs to her attic room. It was barely large enough for the thin mattress on the floor and a small trunk for her few possessions. Cold air whistled through gaps in the walls. She wrapped her shawl tighter and sat by the tiny window, watching snow accumulate on the windowsill. 15 years. How many more stretched ahead of her? The knock on the door the next morning shocked her so completely that she dropped the breakfast tray she'd been carrying upstairs. "Miss Eleanor Ashford?" The man at the door wore the Duke of Ravenswood's livery. Behind him stood the Duke himself, imposing in a dark greatcoat, snowflakes melting in his black hair. Yes?" Eleanor's voice came out barely above a whisper. Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong last night? Was he here to complain? "I've come to speak with Mr. Charles Ashford," the Duke said, his voice deep and calm. "And with you." Charles appeared, pulling his jacket on hastily. "Your Grace! What an unexpected honor. Please, come in, come in. No need?" The Duke remained on the threshold, his eyes finding Eleanor, where she stood, frozen near the stairs. "I have a proposition regarding Miss Ashford." The words that followed felt like a dream. The Duke wanted to hire Eleanor to organize his extensive library. He understood she had received a proper education before her father's death. He was prepared to offer room, board, and a generous wage. "That's quite impossible," Beatrice said, appearing with her hair still in curling papers. Eleanor has obligations here. Family obligations. Does she? The Duke's tone remained pleasant, but something steel entered his voice. I was under the impression she was employed as a servant in your household. Servants may accept new positions, may they not? She's not exactly, Charles began. Not exactly what? The Duke's gray eyes fixed on Charles with an intensity that made Eleanor's half-brother step back. Not exactly a servant? Then she's family, and should be treated as such. Not exactly family? Then she's free to accept employment elsewhere. He paused. Which is it, Mr. Ashford? The silence stretched. Eleanor's heart raced so hard she thought she might faint. The decision, the Duke said, turning to Eleanor, is yours, Miss Ashford. Would you accept the position? She should have hesitated, should have considered, calculated, weighed her options. Instead, the word burst from her lips like a prayer. Yes. No. Beatrice's face flushed, an ugly red. Charles, you cannot allow this. She owes us. She owes you nothing, the Duke interrupted, his voice quiet but absolute. Miss Ashford, gather your belongings. My carriage will wait. Eleanor's hands shook as she climbed to her attic room for the last time. She owned so little it fit in a single carpet bag. 2 spare dresses, her mother's Bible, and a book of poetry her father had given her on her 15th birthday. Everything she was in the world. When she descended, Beatrice stood with her arms crossed, fury radiating from her like heat. You'll regret this. We took you in when you had nothing. You took everything from her, the Duke said, and for the first time, anger showed in his face. Whatever debts you imagine exist are paid in full. Good day, Mrs. Ashford. He offered Eleanor his arm. She stared at it, hardly believing this was real. Come, he said gently. Unless you've changed your mind? She hadn't. She placed her hand on his arm, the first time she'd touched anything fine and clean in years, and walked out of the house that had been her prison. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the sound of the carriage wheels as they pulled away. Eleanor looked back once, saw Beatrice's pinched face in the window, and felt something crack open in her chest. She didn't know if it was her heart breaking or finally beginning to heal. Mrs. Daventry had a face like a friendly hawk and a voice that brooked no nonsense. She met Eleanor in the entrance hall of Ravenswood House with an expression somewhere between approval and skepticism. Well, you're tinier than I expected, the housekeeper said, looking Eleanor up and down. But you've got good posture. That's something. Come along then. His Grace has requested you be given the blue room in the east wing. Eleanor followed, trying not to gape at her surroundings. She'd never been in a house like this. Not as anything, but a servant. The ceiling soared impossibly high, and winter light streamed through windows that looked like they belonged in a cathedral. This is your room, Mrs. Daventry said, opening a door. Eleanor stepped inside and stopped breathing. It was beautiful. Not just the cream-colored wallpaper or the thick carpet beneath her feet. Not just the wardrobe or the writing desk by the window. It was the bed, a real bed, with a thick mattress and what looked like actual down pillows, and a counterpane in soft blue fabric. Is something wrong? Mrs. Daventry asked. Eleanor realized tears were streaming down her face. She wiped at them frantically. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It's just... Her voice broke. It's too much. Understanding dawned in Mrs. Daventry's sharp eyes. Her voice gentled. My dear girl, this is the smallest guest room in the house. Now, dry your eyes. His Grace wants you to understand something very clearly. You're an employee here, not a charity case. You'll work for your wages, same as the rest of us. He values competence, not pity. Can you manage that? Eleanor drew a shaking breath. Pride. She'd almost forgotten what that felt like. Yes, I can manage that. Good. Mrs. Daventry smiled, transforming her austere face. Then wash up, put on something clean, and come down for tea. You look half-starved, and we can't have you collapsing in the library. His Grace would never forgive me. Left alone, Eleanor sat on the bed. It didn't squeak. The mattress didn't sag. She lay back just for a moment, feeling the softness envelope her, and allowed herself 3 heartbeats of pure, terrified happiness before reality crashed back in. This couldn't last. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. The Duke would realize his mistake, or she'd disappoint him, or Beatrice would find some way to drag her back, or, "Stop it," she told herself fiercely. "You're here now. Be here." The library was everything Eleanor had ever dreamed of and more. Books lined the walls from floor to impossibly high ceiling, with one of those wheeled ladders she'd only read about. The smell of leather and paper and beeswax wrapped around her like a benediction. "Do you approve?" She spun. The Duke stood in the doorway, still in his greatcoat, snowflakes melting on his shoulders. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair at his temples. "It's magnificent," she breathed, then caught herself. "I mean, yes, Your Grace. I believe I can organize this collection adequately." His mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but close. "I have no doubt. My predecessor was a collector, but not a curator. Nothing's been catalogued in 30 years. It's chaos masquerading as scholarship." Despite herself, Eleanor laughed. The sound shocked her. When had she last laughed? The Duke's eyes widened slightly, as if the sound had surprised him too. "I'll leave you to explore," he said. "Mrs. Daventry will bring your tea. If you need anything, simply ring." He gestured to the bell pull by the desk. "Your Grace?" The words escaped before she could stop them. "Why did you do this? Why did you help me?" He studied her for a long moment. "Because someone should have helped you long ago," he said finally. "And because I suspect you're precisely the kind of person who will tell me when I'm being an insufferable aristocrat. I find that refreshing." He left before she could respond. Eleanor stood alone among the books, her heart doing something complicated and dangerous in her chest. "Don't," she warned herself. "Don't hope. Don't imagine. He's being kind, nothing more." But when she touched the spines of the books, feeling their leather covers beneath her fingertips, she couldn't quite make herself believe it. The days that followed blurred together in a way that felt almost dreamlike. Eleanor woke in a real bed, ate meals at regular hours, and spent her days surrounded by books. Mrs. Daventry proved to be gruffly affectionate, correcting Eleanor's table manners with the air of someone training a promising but wayward puppy. "You eat like you're afraid someone will snatch the plate away," the housekeeper observed one morning. "Slow down. The food isn't going anywhere." Eleanor blushed, but tried to obey. 15 years of eating whatever scraps remained, of never being certain there'd be more, had left its mark. The Duke himself was often absent, attending to his estates or parliamentary business. But sometimes, late in the afternoon, he'd appear in the library to retrieve a specific book or document, always polite, always correct, always leaving Eleanor with the feeling that he saw more than she wanted to reveal. On her 4th day at Ravenswood House, she found a box on her desk with a note in strong, slanted handwriting for the cataloging. R. Inside were new pencils, pristine paper, and a magnifying glass for examining damaged volumes. Eleanor traced her fingers over the smooth wood of the pencils and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. That night she couldn't sleep. Too soft, she told herself. The bed was too soft after years on a thin mattress. But she knew that was a lie. Her mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying every moment, every word, looking for the trap she knew must be there. Finally, she gave up and wrapped herself in the dressing gown Mrs. Daventry had provided. The house was dark and quiet, but she knew the way to the library now. Perhaps reading would calm her thoughts. She was so absorbed in a volume of Marcus Aurelius, in the original Latin, which her father had taught her to read before he died, that she didn't hear the door open. "I didn't expect to find anyone here at this hour." Eleanor jumped, dropping the book. The Duke stood in the doorway in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his cravat loosened. He looked tired. He also looked, she realized with a start, younger than she'd thought. Not much older than herself, really. "I'm sorry," she said, bending to retrieve the book. "I couldn't sleep. I should have asked permission before." "This is a library, Miss Ashford. Books are meant to be read, not admired from afar." He moved closer, tilting his head to see the spine. His eyebrows rose. "Meditations. In Latin. She clutched the book to her chest. My father taught me. Before, she couldn't finish. Before he died and left you to wolves. The Duke's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Your half-brother told me the circumstances, though he seemed to believe they justified the treatment you received. Eleanor said nothing. What could she say? May I? The Duke gestured to the chair opposite hers. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He sat, and for a moment they remained in silence. The fire crackled softly. Outside, wind rattled the windows. What's your favorite passage? He asked. The question surprised her. From Marcus Aurelius? From anything, she thought. There's a line from the Stoics. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. She laughed softly, bitterly. Though I'm not certain I've mastered that particular wisdom. Few of us have. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But you survived, Miss Ashford. That requires its own kind of strength. Survival isn't the same as living. The words escaped before she could stop them. She froze, horrified at her own boldness. But the Duke didn't look offended. If anything, his expression softened. No, it's not. He was quiet for a moment. I had a sister. Younger than me by 5 years. She married an earl when she was 19. An excellent match, everyone said. Wealthy, titled, respectable. Eleanor heard the past tense. Her heart clenched. He was cruel to her, the Duke continued, his voice steady, but his hands clenched into fists. Not obviously, not in ways anyone could see. But she grew thinner, quieter. When I visited, she'd smile and say, everything was wonderful. He looked at Eleanor, and she saw old pain in his eyes. I believed her, because it was easier than asking uncomfortable questions, than challenging a man of his position. What happened? Eleanor whispered. She died 2 years ago. Fell down the stairs, they said. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she threw herself down them. I'll never know. His voice went rough. But I know I failed her. I saw the signs and chose not to see them. Eleanor's throat tightened. That wasn't your fault. Perhaps not. But I can choose differently now. He met her eyes. I'm not doing this out of pity, Miss Ashford. I need you to understand that. When I saw you in that house, serving those people who should have protected you, I saw someone who deserved better, someone who'd never been given the chance to show what they truly were. And what am I? The question came out barely audible. He smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his entire face. I'm hoping you'll show me, in your own time. They talked until the fire burned low, about books and philosophy, about the difference between Roman and Greek thought, about whether Plato's ideal forms could exist in a world as messy as their own. Eleanor forgot to be afraid, forgot to guard her words. The Duke, Alexander, he'd insisted she call him when they were alone, proved wickedly intelligent, his arguments sharp and playful, drawing her out until she found herself laughing at his deliberately absurd defense of Diogenes. You can't possibly believe that living in a barrel represents the peak of human wisdom, she said, forgetting entirely that she was speaking to a duke. Why not? No servants to manage, no social obligations, no one expecting you to wear a cravat. He tugged at his loosened neckcloth with exaggerated distaste, making her laugh again. When she finally climbed the stairs to her room, the sky was beginning to lighten with dawn. Eleanor lay in her soft bed, watching the ceiling, and realized with dawning terror that she was happy. That was when she started to fall. The next 2 days, Eleanor avoided the library at night. She told herself it was proper, that she shouldn't presume on the Duke's, on Alexander's, kindness. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. She was scared of what she felt when she was near him. You're nothing, Beatrice's voice whispered in her mind. A bastard. A servant. What could a man like that possibly want with you? Mrs. Daventry found her on the 3rd day, staring blankly at a shelf she was supposed to be cataloging. You've been looking at that same shelf for 20 minutes, the housekeeper observed. Either it contains the secrets of the universe, or you're thinking about something else entirely. Eleanor blinked. I'm sorry, I was distracted. Mrs. Daventry sat down, uninvited, in the chair Alexander had occupied. You know, I've worked for His Grace for 7 years, since just after his sister died. He was different then, angry, closed off. These past few days, I've heard him laugh more than in all those years combined. Eleanor's hands stilled on the book she held. Mrs. Daventry. Don't finish that sentence with something about not being good enough, the older woman interrupted. I've raised 4 daughters. I know the sound of a woman talking herself out of something she wants. It's not that simple. It never is, dear, but I'll tell you something His Grace told me once when I tried to refuse a raise in wages. He said, Mrs. Daventry, you may decline what you don't want, but declining what you do want merely to prove you don't deserve it is the worst kind of pride. She stood. Think about that. Eleanor did think about it. She thought about it through dinner, through her evening bath, through the long hour she spent brushing her hair, still marveling at having time for such things. She thought about it as she pulled on her dressing gown, and then she made a decision. She found him in his study this time, working by lamplight. He looked up when she knocked, and something bright flashed across his face before he schooled it to polite welcome. Miss Ashford, can't sleep again? I wanted to thank you, she said, stepping inside, for everything, not just the position, but for seeing me when no one else did. He set down his pen. Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? She nodded, her heart racing. You don't need to thank me for basic human decency. He rose, moving around the desk, but keeping a respectful distance, though I confess I haven't been entirely honest with you. Her stomach dropped. Here it comes, she thought. The catch, the trap. I didn't hire you only because you needed rescue, he continued, though that was part of it. I hired you because when I looked at you that night, even kneeling on the floor, gathering broken glass, you held yourself with more dignity than anyone else in that room. Because when our eyes met, I saw intelligence and strength and something unbroken despite everything they'd tried to break. Because he stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I wanted to know you, and I didn't know how else to make that possible without abusing the massive power imbalance that existed. Eleanor couldn't breathe. I don't understand. Don't you? He took one step closer. I've made myself scarce these past days because I didn't want you to feel obligated. You're employed here. You depend on me for your livelihood. Anything I might feel, any regard I might have, could be seen as coercion. So I've tried to stay away and let you settle. Let you see that this position is real, that your security here isn't contingent on anything but your work. And her voice came out as barely a whisper. What do you feel? I think you know. She did. She'd known since that first night in the library, had been trying desperately not to know. But here in the lamplight, with him looking at her like she was something precious, she couldn't pretend anymore. I'm nobody, she said, and hated how her voice shook. A bastard born of scandal. I have nothing. I am nothing. Stop. The word cracked like a whip. Alexander closed the remaining distance between them, and she could feel the warmth radiating from him. You are Eleanor Ashford. You read Latin and Greek. You've survived 15 years of cruelty without losing your kindness or your keen mind. You make me laugh. You make me think. You make me want to be the kind of man who deserves... He stopped, jaw clenched. I'm not doing this well. Doing what? She was trembling now. Telling you that I'm falling in love with you, he said quietly. And terrified that you'll think it's because I pity you, or because I'm trying to use my position to... Eleanor kissed him. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it. One moment she was staring at him in shock, and the next she'd risen on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was clumsy and unpracticed. She'd never kissed anyone before, but he made a sound low in his throat and his arms came around her, steadying her, holding her like she was something precious that might shatter. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she found her voice. I don't think you pity me, she said. And I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of this. Of how much I want this to be real. How much I want to believe that someone could... That you could. I do, he said fiercely. I do, Eleanor. I want... He stopped, seeming to force himself to step back. But we should wait. give you time to be certain, to know that you're choosing this because you want to, not because you feel grateful or obligated or— Alexander, she interrupted, using his name deliberately, claiming that intimacy. For 15 years, I haven't been allowed to want anything. I'm choosing now. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. His control broke. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Eleanor felt 15 years of numbness crack open into feeling. When his hands came up to cup her face, she realized she was crying. Are you? Alexander pulled back, alarmed. I'm happy, she sobbed, laughing through the tears. I'm so happy I don't know what to do with it. He pulled her against his chest, his hand stroking her hair. She could feel his heart racing against her cheek. Then, we'll figure it out together, he murmured. For as long as you'll have me. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other, while the lamp burned low and the first hints of dawn touched the window. Eleanor had spent 15 years surviving. Now, finally, she was beginning to live. The hammering on the door came the next afternoon. Eleanor was in the library working through a particularly challenging section of medieval manuscripts when she heard raised voices from the entrance hall. Her stomach clenched with instinctive fear. She knew that voice. Beatrice. She was on her feet before she realized it, moving toward the commotion. Mrs. Daventry appeared at the library door, her face set in grim lines. Stay here, the housekeeper ordered. His Grace is dealing with it. Dealing with what? But Eleanor already knew. Your former family has come to retrieve their property. Mrs. Daventry's voice dripped with disdain. Eleanor's hands started to shake. She'd known this peace couldn't last, known Beatrice wouldn't simply let her go. You have to stay here and let His Grace handle it, Miss Daventry interrupted firmly. That's an order, my girl, from me, if not from him. But Eleanor was already moving. She'd spent 15 years learning to be invisible, to not make waves. That girl would have hidden in the library and let others fight her battles. But that girl had kissed a duke last night and chosen happiness. That girl had started to remember she was a person who deserved to be defended. She could at least stand witness to her own salvation. The entrance hall was a portrait of confrontation. Beatrice stood just inside the door, dressed in her finest visiting gown, her face flushed with righteous fury. Beside her, looking uncomfortable, stood Charles. Behind them, both stood Thomas, the elderly footman who'd been the only servant to show Eleanor consistent kindness over the years. Alexander stood on the bottom step of the grand staircase, perfectly composed, his expression carved from ice. He'd never looked more like a duke. Cannot simply steal another man's family, Beatrice was saying. It's unconscionable. She has obligations, duties. She has neither, Alexander said, his voice cold enough to freeze fire. Miss Ashford is a free citizen of England, employed in my household. Unless you have a legal claim to her person, which I doubt, given that slavery was abolished in this country, she owes you nothing. We took her in, fed her, clothed her, gave her a home when her whore of a mother— Finish that sentence, Alexander interrupted softly, and you will be removed from my property by force. Choose your next words very carefully, Mrs. Ashford. Eleanor watched Beatrice's mouth snap shut, her face going purple with rage. Despite her fear, despite everything, Eleanor felt a wild surge of satisfaction. You seduced him, Beatrice said, turning her venom on Eleanor. You spread your legs for the Duke, like your mother did for his father, and now you think yourself above your station. But everyone will know. I'll make certain the entire ton knows what you are. A whore. That's quite enough. Alexander's voice cut through the vitriol like a blade. He descended the remaining stairs and crossed to Eleanor, placing himself between her and Beatrice. You will leave now. If you return to this house, I will have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. Charles! Beatrice turned to her husband. Say something! Do something! Charles shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps we should go, Beatrice. His Grace is within his rights, and Eleanor is, well, she's not actually. He trailed off miserably. Not actually what, Mr. Ashford? Alexander's voice was dangerously soft. Not actually your sister? Not actually your responsibility? Not actually deserving of basic human dignity? She's a bastard, Beatrice spat, a reminder of my husband's father's shame. We housed her out of Christian charity, and this is how she repays us? Something inside Eleanor, something that had been bent and suppressed for 15 years, suddenly snapped. Not broke. Straightened. You're right, she said, her voice steady. She stepped around Alexander, meeting Beatrice's eyes. I am a bastard. My father had an affair with my mother, and I was born from that. But that's his shame, not mine. I didn't choose how I came into this world. Eleanor, Alexander said quietly, but she shook her head. I need to say this. She turned back to Beatrice. You didn't house me out of charity. You kept me because I was useful. Because you wanted free labor and someone to feel superior to. And I let you. For 15 years, I let you make me feel like I deserved it. Like I was worth less than nothing. Her voice grew stronger. But I'm not. I'm a person. I have value. And I will not let you diminish me any longer. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Charles looked at the floor. Behind them, Thomas the footman smiled. Just a tiny quirk of his lips, but Eleanor saw it. Well said, Alexander murmured, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. You'll regret this, Beatrice finally managed, her voice shaking. Both of you. The scandal. Let there be scandal, Alexander said calmly. I've weathered worse. Now leave, Mrs. Ashford, before I lose the last shreds of my patience. Beatrice left, dragging Charles with her, but Thomas lingered for just a moment, catching Eleanor's eye. I'm glad, he said simply. Your father would have been glad too, miss. Then he was gone, and Eleanor was left standing in the entrance hall with Alexander and Mrs. Daventry, shaking like a leaf in a storm. I think, Mrs. Daventry said briskly, that you both need tea, strong tea, and perhaps something stronger than tea. I'll arrange it. When the housekeeper disappeared, Alexander turned to Eleanor. Are you all right? Eleanor laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. I just told off my sister-in-law in a duke's entrance hall. I'm either all right, or I've completely lost my mind. I thought you were magnificent. He cupped her face in his hands. Eleanor Ashford, you are the bravest person I've ever met. I'm terrified, she admitted. She meant what she said. The scandal will pass, he interrupted firmly. I promise you, it will pass. And anyone who thinks less of you because of circumstances you couldn't control isn't worth knowing. She wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into that certainty. But 15 years of fear didn't disappear in a moment. What if? No what ifs, he said gently. Not today. Today, you stood up for yourself. Today, you chose your own worth. That's enough. He was right. It was enough. For now, it was enough. That evening, after dinner, Alexander found her in the library again, their place, she'd come to think of it. She was curled in the chair by the fire, trying to read but mostly staring into the flames. May I join you? He asked. She nodded, and he sat across from her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. I have something to tell you, he said finally, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. Her stomach clenched. All right, I'm hosting a New Year's Eve ball tomorrow night. It's an annual tradition. Half the ton will be there. He leaned forward. I want you to attend, not as my employee, as my guest. Eleanor's heart stopped. Alexander, people will talk. They'll assume correctly, he interrupted. Eleanor, I'm not proposing we hide what we feel. I'm not suggesting we sneak around or pretend you're merely my librarian. I want everyone to know that you're important to me, that you're... He stopped, seeming to search for words. That you're mine, if you'll have me, and I'm yours. You're insane, she whispered. My reputation is my concern. I'm more worried about yours. His expression turned serious. If you do this, there will be talk. Beatrice will make certain of it. Some people will be cruel. It won't be easy. And if I say no, then we'll continue as we are, quietly, until you're ready, or until you decide you don't want this at all. His voice was steady, but she could see the fear in his eyes. I won't pressure you, Eleanor. This has to be your choice. She thought about the attic room where she'd slept for 15 years, thought about serving at tables while people pretended not to see her, thought about swallowing her own voice, her own self, until she'd almost forgotten she had either. Then she thought about last night, about kissing him in the lamplight, about choosing happiness. I'll go, she said, to the ball, as your guest. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. You're certain? I'm terrified, she admitted. But I'm certain. He crossed to her chair, knelt beside it, and took her hands. Then we'll be terrified together. And Eleanor? Yes? Thank you for trusting me, for choosing this. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet. Thank you for giving me something to choose. They sat together by the fire until late into the night, talking and planning, and sometimes just being silent. And when Eleanor finally climbed to her room, she looked at herself in the mirror, really looked, for the first time in years. The woman looking back was thin and pale, with shadows under her eyes and hands roughened by work. But she was standing straight, and she was smiling. Tomorrow night, she would walk into a ballroom full of aristocrats on the arm of a duke. People would stare. People would whisper. Beatrice would probably have an apoplexy. Eleanor found she was very much looking forward to it. The dress was a dream in deep midnight blue, sent up by Mrs. Daventry with a note. His Grace's sisters. She'd want you to have it. D. Eleanor touched the silk with trembling fingers. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, the neckline modest but elegant, the skirt falling in shimmering folds. Mrs. Daventry herself came to help with her hair, pinning it up in a style Eleanor had only seen in fashion plates. You look beautiful, the housekeeper said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Truly beautiful, dear. Eleanor stared at her reflection. She barely recognized herself. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who belonged in a ballroom, someone who might stand beside a duke and not seem absurd. But the face was still hers. The eyes still held too much knowledge of kitchens and attics and small cruelties. What if I can't do this? She whispered. Mrs. Daventry met her eyes in the mirror. Then you'll do it anyway. That's what courage is, child. Not the absence of fear, but doing what matters despite it. The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, music swelling, as Eleanor paused at the top of the grand staircase. Below, the cream of London society swirled in a kaleidoscope of jewels and silk and barely concealed curiosity. She could feel every eye turn toward her. This was a mistake. She should turn around, run back to her room, hide. Eleanor. Alexander appeared at her side, magnificent in black evening clothes, his cravat gleaming white. He offered his arm, and when she took it, she felt his hand cover hers, warm and steady. Breathe, he murmured, for her ears only. I've got you. They descended together. The whispers started immediately. Eleanor heard fragments as they passed. Who is she? Never seen her before. Looks vaguely familiar. Isn't that old Ashford's? Let them talk, she thought, lifting her chin. Let them wonder. Alexander led her through the crowd, nodding to acquaintances, but not stopping. Eleanor noticed how he positioned himself slightly in front of her, a subtle shield against the worst of the stares. Your Grace! A portly gentleman with impressive sideburns intercepted them. What a splendid gathering, and who is this lovely creature? Lord Pemberton, may I present Miss Eleanor Ashford, Alexander said smoothly. Eleanor, Lord Pemberton is a fellow member of Parliament and a notorious gossip. Pemberton laughed, not offended in the slightest. Guilty? As charged. Ashford, you say? Any relation to Charles Ashford of Belgrave Square? Eleanor's stomach clenched, but Alexander answered before she could. Miss Ashford is currently organizing my library, a task that requires considerable skill and learning. I count myself fortunate to have secured her services. The phrasing was deliberate, making it clear she was employed in his household, but emphasizing her capabilities rather than her connections. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude. How fascinating, Pemberton said. though his eyes suggested he found it anything but. "Well, my dear, you must tell me all about—" "Perhaps later," Alexander interrupted smoothly. "I believe the waltz is beginning, and I've promised Miss Ashford the first dance." He swept her onto the floor before Pemberton could protest. Eleanor's heart hammered as Alexander's hand settled at her waist, hers on his shoulder. She'd never danced before, never had the opportunity to learn. "I don't know the steps," she hissed. "Follow my lead," he murmured. "Trust me." The music swelled while he moved, and somehow, miraculously, her feet followed. It wasn't graceful, she stumbled twice, but he steadied her each time, his hand firm at her back, guiding her through the turns. "Everyone's watching," she whispered. "Let them." He pulled her slightly closer, just barely within the bounds of propriety. "Eleonora, look at me." She did. His gray eyes were warm in the candlelight, fixed on her face with an intensity that made her forget the room around them. "I need to tell you something," he said as they turned, "and I'm going to do it badly and probably at entirely the wrong moment, but I can't wait any longer. Alexander, when I brought you to my house, I told myself it was about justice, about righting a wrong, and maybe it was, at first." They spun, and she caught glimpses of faces watching them, but Alexander's voice kept her anchored. "But within days, hours really, I realized the truth. I didn't want to save you. I wanted to know you, and then I wanted to keep you. And now, her voice came out breathless, now I can't imagine my life without you in it." He drew her through another turn, and they were at the edge of the floor now, in a pocket of relative privacy near the tall windows. Not as my employee, not as someone I'm helping, as my equal, as everything. Eleanor's eyes burned with tears. "You can't mean that." "I've never meant anything more." He stopped dancing, holding her there at the edge of the ballroom while the music continued without them. "I'm doing this all wrong. I should wait, should give you more time, should what?" The words burst from her, loud enough that several nearby dancers glanced over. She didn't care. "Should decide for me what I'm ready for? What I can handle? I've had 15 years of people making decisions about my life, Alexander. Don't you start." Surprise flashed across his face, followed by something that looked like delight. "You're right. I apologize." "So tell me," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but determined. "Tell me what you're trying to say." He took both her hands right there in front of everyone. The scandal of it should have mortified her. Instead, she felt powerful. "I love you," Alexander said simply. "I know it's too soon, too fast, too everything. But I love you, Eleanor Ashford. Your courage, your intelligence, your kindness that survived when any reasonable person would have become bitter. I love the way you read Latin at midnight and cry over soft beds and stand up to people who've tormented you for years." He paused. "I love you, and I'm asking, terribly, with no finesse whatsoever, if you might consider marrying me." The room went silent, or maybe Eleanor just stopped hearing anything but the roar of blood in her ears. "You're proposing," she said stupidly, "in the middle of your ballroom." Apparently so. A smile tugged at his lips. "I had planned something more romantic, perhaps in the library, with books." "You're insane." But she was smiling now, tears streaming down her face, not caring who saw. "You're a duke. I'm nobody. You're everything," he interrupted fiercely. "And if you say you're nobody one more time, I'm going to have to kiss you right here in front of Lord Pemberton and the entire assembled aristocracy, which will cause a scandal that will last for years." "You wouldn't dare." His smile turned wicked. "Try me." Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy that surprised her with its strength. Around them, she could hear murmurs growing louder, shock and disapproval and fascination all mixed together. Somewhere in the crowd, she spotted a flash of Beatrice's face, purple with fury. "Good," she thought savagely. "Watch this." "Yes," she said clearly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you." He kissed her, right there in front of everyone, both hands cradling her face like she was something infinitely precious. Eleanor heard gasps, scandalized whispers. Someone's fan snapping shut with a sharp crack. She didn't care. She wrapped her arms around Alexander's neck and kissed him back, pouring 15 years of suppressed feeling into it, all the pain and loneliness and desperate hope. When they broke apart, the room had erupted. Some guests looked appalled. Others were whispering frantically. A few, a very few, were smiling. "Well," Alexander said, slightly breathless, "I believe we've given them something to talk about." "I believe you've ruined me," Eleanor said, but she was grinning. "Then I suppose I'll have to marry you quickly, to preserve your honor." His expression turned serious. "Eleanor, are you all right? I know this is—" "I'm perfect," she interrupted, and realized, with dawning wonder, that it was true. For the first time in 15 years, I'm absolutely perfect. The clock began to chime midnight. Around them, the ballroom erupted in celebration as the new year arrived. Alexander pulled her close, his forehead touching hers. "Happy New Year," he murmured. "Happy New Year," she echoed. They were immediately surrounded by well-wishers, some genuine, others clearly just seeking gossip. Alexander fielded them all with smooth diplomacy, never letting go of Eleanor's hand. She caught Mrs. Daventry's eye across the room. The housekeeper was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, beaming. It was Lord Pemberton who finally asked the question everyone was clearly dying to know. "Ashford, did you say? Any relation to—" "Miss Ashford is the daughter of William Ashford," Alexander said firmly, cutting off speculation. "She was educated as a lady before circumstances forced her into reduced situations. Those circumstances are now rectified, and soon she'll be the Duchess of Ravenswood. I trust that clarifies matters." The message was clear. This was not a scandal. This was a love match between a duke and a gentlewoman who'd fallen on hard times. Anyone who suggested otherwise would answer to him. Eleanor loved him even more for it. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Eleanor danced, badly but happily, with Alexander and several of his friends who proved kinder than she'd expected. She met members of Parliament, wealthy merchants, and various aristocrats, all clearly reassessing her now that she'd been claimed by one of England's most powerful dukes. It should have felt hollow, should have felt like she was only valuable because of him. But it didn't. Because every time someone tried to condescend to her, Alexander would casually mention her intelligence or her work organizing his library. Because he introduced her as his equal, not his charity case. Because when an elderly countess asked, with ill-concealed malice, whether Eleanor's family would be attending the wedding, Alexander smiled and said, "Only the family that matters. Mrs. Daventry has already promised to stand with Eleanor." The countess had retreated, flustered, and Eleanor had wanted to kiss him again, right there. She caught a glimpse of Beatrice and Charles leaving early, Beatrice's face a mask of fury. Charles met Eleanor's eyes for just a moment, and she thought she saw something like regret there. Or maybe just relief that she was no longer his problem. Either way, she found she didn't care. Near dawn, when the last guests were finally departing, Alexander led her back to the library. Their place. He built up the fire while she sank into her favorite chair, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. "No regrets?" he asked, settling across from her. Eleanor thought about it seriously, about the whispers and the stares and the scandal that would follow them for months, about Beatrice's fury and the shocked faces of the ton. "None," she said firmly. "You?" "Only that I didn't do this sooner." He reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand. "Though I suppose we needed time, for you to know yourself again, for me to prove I wasn't just playing hero." "You're not a hero," Eleanor said softly. "You're just a good man who saw someone in pain and chose to act. That shouldn't be heroic. It should be ordinary. Perhaps." He turned her hand over, studying her palm. The cut from the broken wine glass had healed, leaving only a faint scar. "But I think we're both more than we were. You taught me that standing by isn't an option. That passive kindness isn't enough. And you taught me that I deserved more than survival." Eleanor's throat tightened. that I could want things, choose things. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire. Outside, London was waking to the new year. Inside, Eleanor felt something shifting, settling, finally coming to rest. I should write to Mrs. Daventry's daughters, she said suddenly, to thank them for the dress. I'll write with you, Alexander offered. And then we should probably sleep. We have a wedding to plan. How quickly can it be done? Eleanor asked, then blushed. Is that terribly improper to ask? Alexander laughed, the sound warm and delighted. Given that I kissed you in front of half the ton, I think we're past worrying about propriety. A month? 2? A month, Eleanor said decisively. I don't want to wait. Neither do I. He stood, pulling her to her feet, into his arms. Eleanor Ashford, soon to be Eleanor Blackwood, I promise you this. No one will ever make you feel less than you are again. Not while I draw breath. She believed him. More importantly, she believed herself, believed in her own worth, her own strength. Alexander had given her the opportunity to remember it, but the strength had always been hers. I have a promise for you too, she said. I promise to never let you forget that being a good man isn't about grand gestures. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. And you do that, Alexander. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both smiling, Eleanor felt the last knot of fear inside her unravel. She'd spent 15 years living as a servant in her own family's house. One night, a duke had set her free. But in truth, she'd freed herself. She'd chosen to hope, to trust, to want. She'd chosen to stand up and say, I deserve better. Alexander had given her the opportunity, but the choice had been hers, and that made all the difference. 6 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the small chapel at Ravenswood Estate, wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of winter roses. Mrs. Daventry stood beside her as her only attendant, dabbing at her eyes with yet another handkerchief. In the front pew, Thomas the footman sat with several other servants from the Ashford house, who'd quietly reached out to congratulate her, all the invisible people who'd seen her suffering and were glad to see her happiness. No one from the Ashford family attended. Eleanor hadn't invited them. Alexander waited at the altar, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. When she reached him, he took her hand, and she felt 15 years of pain and fear finally, fully release their hold. Ready? He whispered. I've been ready since that first night in the library, she whispered back. The vicar began to speak. Eleanor barely heard the words. She was too busy memorizing this moment, the warmth of Alexander's hand, the smile on Mrs. Daventry's face, the winter light streaming through stained glass windows. When it came time for her vows, her voice was clear and steady. I promise to stand beside you as an equal, to challenge you when you're wrong, and support you when you're right, to never forget where I came from or what I learned there, and to love you always for seeing who I truly was when I'd almost forgotten myself. Alexander's voice was rough with emotion when he replied, I promise to never take for granted the gift of your trust, to honor the strength that brought you through darkness, to stand with you against anyone who would diminish you, and to love you always for teaching me that heroism isn't about rescue, it's about recognition. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander kissed her, Eleanor tasted salt and realized she was crying. But she was smiling too, and for the first time in 15 years, the tears were entirely, completely happy. They walked out of the chapel into winter sunshine, and Eleanor looked up at the man who was now her husband, the Duke, who'd offered her a position, then his heart, then his name. Thank you, she said simply. For what? Alexander asked, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. For everything, for nothing, for just being you. He smiled down at her, love written plainly on his face. The gratitude is entirely mutual, Your Grace. Your Grace. The title still felt strange, but Eleanor was learning to accept strange and wonderful things, learning to believe she deserved them. They walked toward the house, Their house, their home, through snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Behind them, the chapel bells began to ring, marking the occasion with joyful noise. Eleanor had spent 15 years as a servant in her own home, invisible and voiceless. Now she was seen, she was heard, she was loved, but most importantly, most wonderfully, she was herself. And that was the greatest freedom of all.